I've created a Visual Basic application that has a label control. The auto size property has been set to false, so it's fairly large. And I've got the text property set to which campus and have it aligned in the center of the label, middle center, and the back color changed to yellow. Then I have a button named BTN SMCC, and its code sets the text property of my label, LVL Campus, to SMCC. Then I'm going to bring up a message box using the show method. It's going to have a prompt of Go Cougars and a title of SMCC. And then I'm going to set the back color to blue. Now I chose this order because I want to demonstrate one thing that a message box accomplishes in addition to another way of doing output. We've used labels and text boxes for output thus far. A message box will bring up, in essence, a dialog box, and it's called a modal dialog, and that the user has to respond to it before control continues on in the execution of the program. So let me just demonstrate this by running my program. So there is my application. I'm going to click the message box demo. It has changed the text of my label, brings up the message box with a prompt of Go Cougars and a title of SMCC, but it hasn't yet changed the color of my label, or the back color of it. And that's because it's waiting for me to respond. So as soon as I click OK, it changes the color. So that's one advantage of a message box. If you want to pause your program at some point, a message box will let you easily do that, in addition to providing some output. And a third thing a message box accomplishes for us is that we can allow the user to select different buttons, and based on the choice that they make, we could have the program go in one of 2 or 3 different directions. Let's take a little closer look at the MessageBox.Show method. The simplest form of a message box is to have just a prompt shown in the message, and the format there is MessageBox, which is a class, .show. Show is a method, and I know it's a method because of the parentheses. And inside those parentheses, I'm providing some arguments that relate to the parameters of that class. So the argument that I'm presenting here in the simple format is just a prompt. And whatever's in that prompt is what would show up in our message box. So we have an example down here of MessageBox.Show, and then in quotes, welcome to C#. Again, this is a literal string that's in quotes, so the compiler understands it. This prompt has to be a string value. In this case, we're using a literal string. Here's another example in which, rather than using a literal string, I have a string variable called x that contains a value of coding is fun. Again, that is a literal string. And then my message box is simply showing whatever the value of x is. And so the result is we get coding is fun as the prompt of our message box. It can also be a property value or some other string value or some value that is set to a string. So in this case, my message box is showing the text property of the button itself, BTN prompt. That is a string value. And the caption of our button was simple message box prompt only. We can also use what's called concatenated strings, in which we're combining string elements together. Now in C# we do that with a plus symbol. So I have here a literal string, the text of this button is, and I'm adding to that, or concatenating to that, the text property of the button itself. In VB it's just slightly different in that rather than using a plus sign, I use an ampersand. So again, the literal string, the text of this button is, that's all in quotes, and I do put a space after the semicolon so it doesn't all run together. And then I'm going to concatenate or add to that the text property of BTN prompt. We'll look at string concatenation here in a couple weeks. I can also change this format a little bit and put 2 values inside the parentheses. The first one's going to be my prompt, and the second one's going to be a title. The show method of the MessageBox class is what we call an overloaded method. It can take different parameters or different arguments, and based on those, give us different results. But each method is named the same. So here the show method has a prompt and a title. And my example here again is welcome to C#. And then my title is C# at SMCC. And they're separated by a comma. They are both little strings. They're each enclosed in quotes. And so the C# at SMCC appears on the title bar of the dialog. And then my prompt is here. Just as we used literal strings and properties and concatenated strings for our prompt, we can do the same thing for the title. A third way of providing arguments to this show method is to add a buttons designation. So we have our prompt, comma, title, comma, and then the buttons. The button choices belong to the MessageBox.Buttons class, and so we can have a comma, MessageBox.Buttons dot, and then I can choose, in this case, OK cancel, which now gives me two buttons. Earlier we just had one, which was an OK button. That's the default if we don't specify a buttons argument. But if we do, here we can have two, OK or cancel. And we can actually figure out which one the user clicked on and do one of two different things based on which button they chose. We have some other choices for MessageBox buttons. One is abort, retry, ignore, which gives us those three buttons, abort, retry, ignore. The default button is abort. Or we can have just the OK button, which is what we've seen if we didn't specify a buttons argument. So that is the default. We have a choice of retry, cancel, and another choice of yes, no. And then finally we have a choice of yes, no, cancel. Notice that the yes button is the default of those three, and you'll see in a minute how you can change which one is the default button. A fourth argument that can be added to our show method is to display an icon. And again, we would separate this with a comma. And the choices for that icon are part of the MessageBox.Icon class. And we really have four choices, although there's actually more than that, but some of them are the same. So I have a choice of information, dot information, or dot asterisk. Both of those will give me this little icon with a blue circle and a white eye inside that circle. I also have a choice of either .error, .hand, or .stop, and all three of those give me an icon of a red circle with a white X inside of it. We have a choice of either .exclamation or .warning, and both of those give us a yellow triangle with a black exclamation mark. And then finally we have a choice of .question, which gives us a blue circle with a white question mark. There is a fifth parameter that we can add in, and that is which button we want to be the default. And here our choices are button 1, button 2, or button 3, all of which are values in the MessageBox.Default.Button class. So encoding that, I would have a comma after the icon, MessageBox.Default.Button, dot, then whichever button choice I wanted to be the default. The example here is I've made the button 2 my default, which is the retry button. By making it the default, the user can simply press the Enter key rather than having to click on that button. And the only difference between C# and VB is that in VB we would not have the semicolon at the end of the line. Everything else would be exactly the same.